I want you to understand something before I tell you anything else. I have been riding motorcycles for 53 years, not as a hobby, not on weekends when the weather permits and the mood strikes. 53 years as a way of being alive, which is a different thing entirely from simply having a life. I have put miles on this country, the way other men put miles on their shoes, wearing it down through daily use, knowing its texture by feel, knowing its moods, by the way the air changes before you can see any reason for it to change. I have ridden through 41 states. I have ridden in heat that warped the blacktop into something that looked more like water than road. I have ridden in cold that crept inside my gloves and sat against my knuckles for hours without ever fully leaving. I have ridden through nights so dark and so long that the only thing telling me I was still moving forward was the sound of the engine underneath me and the way the wind pushed against my chest. I have seen things on the road that most people would not believe, and a few things even now that I still have some trouble believing myself. But none of it, not one single mile of all those miles, prepared me for what happened in Mill Haven, Kansas, on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was 59 years old that year, younger than I am now, older than I felt on most mornings when I swung my leg over the seat. I'd been riding with the Wichita chapter for 22 years by then, long enough that the road had stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like home, which is a different thing. Freedom is what you feel when you leave. Home is what you feel when you can no longer imagine being anywhere else. I am telling you this now from a distance of 13 years. I am 72 years old, and my knees remind me of that number every single morning. The details of what happened that September have not faded the way most things fade. If anything, they have gotten clearer. The kind of clarity that comes not from distance but from return, from turning something over in your hands so many times that you finally begin to understand what it is you have been holding. There were 79 of us that day, coming back from the Greer County Fair 3 towns east of Wichita. Cole Hargrove had organized it the way Cole organized most things, which is to say, he said we were going and assumed everyone would follow, which they did, because Cole had a way of making the next reasonable thing feel like the only possible thing. He was 52 years old, our chapter president, gray in the beard, and quiet in the way that men get quiet when they have made enough decisions to stop needing to talk about making them. I had ridden with him for 15 years. I knew his silences the same way I knew the sound of my own engine. We left the fairgrounds around 2 in the afternoon. The sky was clear when we pulled out, the kind of flat, pale blue that Kansas does in September when summer has mostly finished arguing with autumn, but has not quite surrendered. I was riding third from the front just behind Cole, and a man named Vern Hatch, who was about 70 years old, bad hip, and constitutionally incapable of letting that fact affect his output in any visible way. It was Cole who first looked at the sky differently. I noticed it about 20 miles outside Mill Haven on Route 17, the way he tilted his head slightly to the northeast, and then held that position a beat too long to be casual. I had known Cole long enough to know that when he watched something without speaking, the thing he was watching mattered. I looked northeast. The color was wrong. If you did not grow up in central Kansas, this is difficult to explain in a way that fully communicates the specific weight of it. There is a color the sky gets before certain storms. It is not simply dark. Darkness is something you can prepare for, something the eye can adjust to. This is different. It is a kind of yellow-green, flat and muted, like the sun is shining through something it should not be able to shine through, like the light itself has gotten confused about where it is going. My mother's family had farmed that land since before the First World War, and the first thing my grandfather ever taught me, before he taught me anything else, was how to read that color. When you see it, you do not discuss it. You do not consult anyone. You move. Cole got on the radio. We used headset communications on long rides, the kind you can hear clearly over engine noise. And what he said was 4 words. We need cover now. That was Cole. 4 words when 4 words did the job. I looked northeast again. There was a smear of rotation low on the horizon. 2 cloud formations moving in directions that made no meteorological sense. The kind of convergence that builds towards something specific and purposeful. We had been in weather before. We had crouched under highway overpasses while hail the size of nickels bounced off the pavement around us. We had sat out rain so heavy and so personal feeling that it seemed directed at us specifically. But this was something with intention behind it, and we all knew the difference. We came up Route 17 into Mill Haven at a speed that I will not specify, but will acknowledge was not strictly aligned with posted limits. And I want to be honest about what we were feeling in those minutes. Because I think honesty about it matters. We were scared. Not the kind of scared that locks you in place. The other kind. The kind that makes your hands very steady and your thinking extremely clear. The kind that strips away everything non-essential and leaves only the next decision. Which was that we needed a structure, a basement, or an interior room or a culvert or anything that was not open sky, and we needed it in the next 3 minutes. That is when I saw her. She was standing on the porch of a small white house on the corner of Alderman and 5th Street. I learned the street names later. At the time, I only saw the house and then I saw her. And then it was not possible to see anything else because she was the kind of thing you do not look away from. Once you have looked, she could not have weighed more than 95 pounds. She was standing straight, both hands at her sides, not holding on to anything. Not braced against anything, just standing the way a fence post stands. As though she had been planted there, with the specific intention that she would remain. Her hair was white and pulled back. She was wearing a blue cardigan over a house dress that I later found out she had owned since 1978. She was looking southwest toward the same piece of sky that had been troubling us for the last 10 miles. She was completely calm. I want you to think about that for a moment. Not calm in the way of someone who has not yet understood what is coming. Calm in the way of someone who has understood it entirely and has already made the only decision available to her. The sky behind her was doing the thing it does going that particular yellow-green that sits in your chest like a stone. And this woman, 97 years old, alone on her porch, was looking at it the way you look at something you have seen before. Cole pulled his bike to a stop in front of her gate. I pulled up behind him. 77 more bikes came in behind me, filling the street engines, cutting one by one until there was just the sound of the wind, which by then had found its voice a low register that you feel more in your sternum than you hear with your ears. Cole took off his helmet. He looked at the sky once more, and then he looked at her. And what he said came out in a register I had not heard from him before. It was the voice of a man asking for something he had no right to expect. He told her there was a tornado forming and asked if there was any chance. "Get in the basement," she said. She did not yell it. She did not ask our names. She did not ask what patch we were wearing, what chapter we came from, what we had done or not done in the years that had led us to her street. She looked at 79 men in leather vests with road miles and history written on them, and she said, "Get in the basement," and then she opened her front door and held it. I've thought about that gesture more times than I can count in the 13 years since it happened. She opened her door and she held it open, and she did not move from the frame until every single one of us was inside. And I want to be precise about what that looked like, because precision is the only way I know how to honor it. 79 men, leather patches, chrome residue on our hands, and road dust on our boots. The kind of image that makes people cross to the other side of the street before we come within speaking distance. And she held the door. Cole was the first one off his bike. I was the second. After that, it happened fast. The way things happen when no one is deliberating anymore. When the moment has made the decision for everyone, and all that remains is movement. I remember passing her in the doorway. I remember the smell of the house hitting me as I crossed the threshold. Soup on the stove, something clean underneath it like cedar, old wood that had been lived in for so many decades. It had absorbed the life inside it and given it back as warmth. I remember the staircase down to the basement, narrow, the banisters smooth from years of use. And I remember her voice behind me as I went down. She was counting, not loudly, not performing it for anyone, just counting steadily the way you count when accuracy matters to you, when the number means something specific. I heard her voice at 32 when I passed. I heard it at 47 when I reached the bottom step. I heard it continuing above me as more men filed through the door she was still holding. And what I understood without needing to be told was that she was making sure. She was making sure not one of us got left outside. 97 years old, her own house, a tornado 8 minutes out, and she was standing at her door counting strangers in. Something happened to me on that staircase. I'm not sure I can fully explain it even now. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was more like the feeling of recognizing something you did not know you had been looking for, a shift so quiet that you almost miss it. Like the moment a key finds the right tumbler in a lock and the mechanism gives way. I went down to the basement and I found my place among the others, and I stood there with the feel of that counting still in my chest. The basement was a working space. Shelves along every wall, floor to ceiling, stocked with canned goods and mason jars, and the kind of organized inventory that speaks of a person who has never once assumed the world would provide what she needed without preparation on her part. 30 years of canning, she would tell us later. And I believed it immediately because the evidence was on those shelves in quantities that made a statement about what it meant to be ready. There was a water heater in the corner wrapped in a blanket, a workbench along one wall with tools hung on pegboard, in the kind of order that tells you they get used and returned the order of actual work rather than decoration. In the center of the room was a wooden stool. She sat on it the way a person sits on something they have sat on for a long time, not perched, not settling in. Just present the way an object is present in a space it belongs to. Her hands were folded in her lap. The single bulb on its cord above us swung once in a slow arc as the pressure outside shifted. And she watched it swing and she waited. 79 men in a basement. I want you to hear how quiet it was. Not the quiet of men who have nothing to say. The quiet of men who understand that some moments do not belong to noise. Earl Tatum, who we called Brick, was somewhere near the back wall. He was a big man out of Louisiana, 300 pounds of quiet that usually expressed itself in stillness rather than words. And he had his eyes closed. I figured he was praying. When he opened them and found Dorothy looking at him, he nodded once. She nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The tornado lasted 11 minutes. I know because I counted, which is an old habit from childhood in the tornado country. The way you count to manage what you cannot control. In the basement of Dorothy Wainwright's house on Alderman and 5th Street in Mill Haven, Kansas, 79 grown men sat in the near dark. and listened to the world rearrange itself overhead. And not one of us made a sound that I would describe as anything other than respectful. The walls groaned once, a deep structural sound that was more felt than heard. Something heavy crossed the roof. The bulb swung again. And in the center of the room on her wooden stool, Dorothy Wainwright sat with her hands folded and her eyes open. And she waited with the patience of someone who has outlived enough storms, literal and otherwise, to know that waiting is not the same as helplessness. I was watching her the way you watch something when you cannot help yourself. She was not bracing. She was not tense. She was there the way a person is there when they have nowhere else to be, and no part of themselves is somewhere else. It had been a long time since I had seen anyone look that way. It had been a long time since I had felt that way myself. There is a question I did not ask myself in that basement. Not consciously, not in those words, but something in me was asking it without language, the way the body asks its questions through sensation rather than thought. The question was this: when did I stop being here? When did some part of me start living somewhere else in some other time, turning something over and over that would not be turned into something useful, no matter how many miles I put between myself and it? I did not have the answer, but the question was there. It had always been there. I had simply been moving fast enough that it could not quite catch me. The sound dropped, not gradually, not in stages. It dropped the way a curtain drops, and the silence that followed was the specific silence of aftermath, the silence of a world taking stock of what it has just done. She stood up before any of us moved. "That is done," she said. "Let us see what we have got." She walked up the stairs the same way she had come down, without assistance, without hurry. Cole was the first of us to follow. I was directly behind him. The kitchen was intact. There was a crack in the window above the sink, long and clean, the glass held together by something no one could entirely account for. The front door was standing open. The wind had managed that, and through it we could see the porch. And past the porch we could see the street. 3 of our bikes were down. A section of fence from somewhere up the block had crossed the road in a diagonal line. The big elm in front of the neighbor's house had split at the trunk and taken a section of power line with it, in a tangle of wire and branch that would take a crew the better part of a day to address. But the house was standing. Her house was standing, all of it intact, except for the left porch rail, which, as I later learned, had been leaning since well before the storm anyway. I watched Cole look at the street. He went very still. The way he went still when he was assessing. Not shocked, not processing. Running numbers. Then he turned to Dorothy. "Your bikes," she said, and looked at the 3 machines lying on their sides. "They will ride," Cole said. He looked at the power line. He looked at the house. Then, because Cole always came to the point, he told her she was going to lose power. "I have a generator in the shed," she said. "Starts on the 3rd pull if you are patient with it." I have known Cole Hargrove for 15 years. I can count on both hands the things that have genuinely surprised him in my presence, and I would have fingers left over. That was one of those moments. Not because of the generator, because of the way she said it, as though she were briefing him, as though she had already decided he was a person worth telling the practical truth to, without preface and without performance. People did not do that with Cole as a rule. They got careful around him, or they got formal, or they got whatever version of themselves they thought the situation required. Dorothy Wainwright had apparently not received that particular memo. Jake Pruitt found the generator on the 2nd pull. He was 23 years old, the newest member of our chapter, and he came to find me afterward with the expression of a man who has just done something he did not know he was capable of. I told him the third pull was the one with character. He told me to mind my own business, which was the most complete sentence I had heard from him in 2 weeks, and I counted it as a good sign. Some of the men had come up from the basement and were already moving. No one had given instructions. That is something about working men that I have always respected, the ability to see what needs doing and begin without requiring anyone to ask. Bikes were righted. The fence section was cleared from the road. Vern Hatch found a broken shutter hanging from one hinge at the side of the house and had it reattached before anyone else had noticed it was loose. Jake found a broom on the porch and began sweeping grit from the front steps. With the focused attention of someone who has found a task and intends to complete it properly. "You do not have to do that," Dorothy told him. "I know," he said, and kept sweeping. I liked her in that moment, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not do. She watched him sweep. She decided it was acceptable, and she moved on. That is a kind of wisdom that is rarer than it looks, knowing when to stop arguing with someone who is already doing the right thing. Cole tried to pay her for the damage to the property. I heard the conversation from the porch where I was helping Sandra, one of our few female members, practical as a socket wrench, and twice as reliable, assess the situation with the downed line. "I want to pay for the damage," Cole said. "The porch rail has been loose since George W. Bush's second term," Dorothy said. "I am not charging you for gravity." Cole went quiet. She had surprised him again. 2 surprises in 20 minutes was, in my experience, some kind of record. She fed us before we left. 14 jars of vegetable soup from those basement shelves warmed on the gas stove, served in mismatched bowls that told the accumulated history of 60 years of household. Living bowls from different decades and different occasions that had all ended up in the same cabinet and been pressed into service without discrimination. We ate standing up in the kitchen on the porch on the front lawn. 79 people eating from the bowls of a woman who had opened her door to us because the sky was the wrong color, and there was not time for anything else. Nobody broke a single bowl. I checked after. I do not entirely know why I checked, but I did, and none of them were broken. I have eaten a lot of meals in a lot of places over 53 years on the road. That soup in those bowls standing in the front yard of a white house in Mill Haven, with 3 motorcycles still showing the marks of where they had gone down, was one of the best meals I have ever eaten in my life. I have thought about why that is. I think it is because there was no pretense in it, no ceremony. She had food. We needed food. She gave us food, and the giving was clean and complete, and asked for nothing in return. When we were loading up to leave, Cole went back to the porch. I watched him from where I was securing my gear. He stood with his helmet under his arm, and I could see him working on how to end something that did not have a clean ending. Cole was good at beginnings and middles. Endings gave him more trouble. "I meant what I said about paying for the damage," he told her. "I know you did," she said. "And I meant what I said about not charging you. We are at an impasse. Have a safe ride." He nodded, once the kind of nod that carries more weight than its size would suggest, and walked back to his bike. I was 3 bikes back from Cole when we turned onto Route 17 heading west. The sky had gone to that specific pale color. It goes after a major storm, when the air has been thoroughly wrung out and everything left standing is standing because it has earned the right to. I was riding and thinking about soup, and about 79 men going quiet in a basement, and about a wooden stool in the center of a room, and the woman who sat on it as though stillness were a skill she had practiced until it became second nature. I was not thinking about what she had said to me. That is not accurate. I was not letting myself think about it. There is a difference. Then Cole pulled up beside me and said she counted us out too. I looked at him. When we were loading up, he said. She was standing at the door. She counted every bike out. I watched her from the road. She waited until the last one before she went back inside. We rode without speaking for a while. Some things do not need to be added to, but something was working in me that I was not ready to name. I could feel it the way you feel a change in elevation. When you are riding not as a fact your mind has registered, but as something your body already knows. I have mentioned that I found my way to the back of the departure line. What I have not told you yet is why. I had left something inside. A handkerchief, old blue cotton, fraying at one corner that I had owned since before I can clearly remember. I noticed it missing when I reached for it at my bike, and I turned around and went back up the porch steps and knocked on the frame of the open door. Dorothy was at the door when I turned back toward the street. She had not come inside yet. She was standing where Cole had described at the threshold, watching the last of the bikes find their way out to Route 17. She heard my step on the porch and looked back at me, and there was no surprise in her face, only the expression of someone who had expected this and was prepared to continue. I told her I had left a handkerchief. She went in and came back with it in under a minute. Blue cotton. She held it out to me, and I took it, and I should have left then. There was no reason to stay. The sky was already beginning to clear, and the others were waiting, and I had what I came back for. But she spoke before I could turn. Walter rode for 12 years, she said, before his knees went bad and the road stopped being something he could manage. He used to say that the road is honest about one thing. He said the road shows you what you are avoiding. He said it never lies about that. I looked at the handkerchief in my hand. I did not look at her. I am not avoiding anything I said. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In my experience, 4 seconds of silence from a person who has chosen to be quiet is a complete sentence. It has content. It has weight. It means something that words would only approximate. When I finally looked up, she was looking at me the way certain people look when they already know the answer to a question and are simply waiting for the other person to be ready to know it too. Not impatient, not pressing, just present in that particular way she had of being present entirely and without reservation. Then she went back inside. I stood on the porch of her house for what might have been a minute or might have been considerably longer. The street in front of me was emptying out the last of the engines, diminishing down Route 17 in the direction of Wichita. The elm in the neighbor's yard lay in its 2 halves. The power line hung in its tangle. The fence section had been moved to the grass at the curb, waiting for whoever would come to address it. And in that minute, or that longer than a minute standing on the porch of a woman I had met 90 minutes ago, with a fraying blue handkerchief in my hand and the sound of departing engines in my ears, I thought about my son. I thought about Garrett. I had not thought about him directly in several weeks. Not the way you think about a person when you let yourself look at them plainly, without moving around the outside of the thought. I had thought about the fact of him the way you think about weather, or about a country you have not visited, from a certain distance, with a certain practiced management. That afternoon on Dorothy Wainwright's porch, the distance collapsed. Garrett Dinarret Decker, 35 years old, living in Oklahoma City with a job I knew the title of, but not the details, in an apartment whose address I had written down from his last verifiable location and put in my wallet without ever using. My son, who had not spoken to me in 8 years. The last conversation we had was in a hospital corridor in a city I had driven to from Missouri in 4 hours and 20 minutes. which was the fastest I had ever covered that particular stretch of road. His mother, my wife of 26 years, had gone into the hospital 2 days before I got the call that she was not going to come back out. Garrett had been there for both of those days. He had been there alone. When I arrived, she was still alive. I was there when she died, which I have held on to for 8 years as evidence of something, though lately I have become less certain of what. Garrett stood beside me in that corridor afterward, and he said without anger, which was in some ways worse than anger, 4 hours, he said. 3 hours. 2 hours. Every time you came through that door at the last possible moment and told yourself you had made it. He said you were always there for the last part. I was always there for the rest of it. He said, I cannot do this anymore. And then he walked out of the hospital, and I have not had a real conversation with him since. 8 years, my son, who had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubbornness and a laugh that I had spent years not thinking about, because thinking about it required also thinking about how long it had been since I'd heard it. I had written him 23 letters in 8 years. I know the number exactly because I counted them, kept them in the back of a kitchen drawer, in an envelope that I had labeled with no address and no name, just letters as though the word itself was the destination. 23 letters, each one complete, finished, sealed. Not one of them sent. I had been on the road for 53 years. I had crossed this country in every weather and in every season. I had ridden through grief and through boredom, and through the specific, unnameable hunger that keeps certain men moving when they should probably be still. And I had never once been able to put a stamp on an envelope addressed to my son. Standing on Dorothy Wainwright's porch, I finally let myself know why. Because if I sent it, and he did not answer, there would be nothing left to hope for. As long as the letters were in the drawer, there was still a chance. As long as I had not sent them, I had not yet been fully refused. The road is honest about one thing. It shows you what you are avoiding. I put the handkerchief in my jacket pocket. I walked down the porch steps and got on my bike and pulled out onto Alderman Street toward Route 17. I was the last one out. I did not look back at the house, but I knew without looking that she was at the door. And I knew she was counting. I caught up to the tail end of the chapter about 2 miles out of Mill Haven. Cole drifted back until he was riding beside me and asked with one look whether I was all right. I told him I was. He nodded and we rode together for a while without speaking. At some point I noticed the front pocket of his vest. There was an envelope there, just the corner of it visible above the edge of the pocket. I could see it was sealed. I could see the handwriting on the front was a woman's, careful and deliberate. I could see the postmark stamp, and from where I was riding I could not make out the city, but I could see by the color of the stamp and the date that it had been there for at least 3 months, unopened. Cole did not mention it. I did not ask about it. We rode. The sun was low by the time we reached the western edge of Wichita, going red and lateral. The kind of light that makes the Kansas flatlands look like something worth painting. I peeled off from the chapter at the usual point, took my usual route back through the residential streets to the east side of town, where I had lived for 11 years in a house with a front porch I almost never sat on, and a kitchen with good light that I used mainly for coffee. I went inside. I set my keys on the counter. I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes in the way you stand in your own space when you have been away and are relearning the dimensions of it. Then I opened the drawer. The envelope was there where I always kept it, off-white, slightly bent at one corner from being in the drawer so long, and on the front in my own handwriting just the one word: letters. I took it out and opened it and spread them on the counter, all 23 of them, all sealed. all addressed in the same handwriting to the same address in Oklahoma City that was 3 years old now, and might not even be current. I stood there looking at them for a long time. 23 letters, 8 years. A son who had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubbornness, who was 35 years old and living a life I knew almost nothing about, who had last spoken to me in a hospital corridor and said he could not do this anymore. And a woman I had met 3 hours ago, 97 years old, standing at a door in a wrong-colored light, counting strangers in. I put the letters back in the envelope. I put the envelope back in the drawer. I closed the drawer. But I did not leave the kitchen. I stood there in the good light for a long time after, with the feel of that counting still somewhere in my chest. And I did not know what to do with it. And for the first time in a very long time, that fact did not send me to my bike. 11 days. That is how long it took Cole Hargrove to make the calls. And I want to tell you something about how those calls got made, because it matters to understanding what happened next. Cole did not send a message to the chapter listserv. He did not post anything anywhere. He picked up his phone and he called people one at a time, the way men of his generation made things happen, through direct contact, through the weight of a voice, rather than the convenience of a notification. And what he said, from what I was told by the people he called, was not a request and not an order. It was closer to an observation. He said that there was a woman in Mill Haven who had opened her door to all of us, and that her house needed work, and that he was going on Saturday morning. That was it. He said what was true, and he let people decide. By Thursday, he had a count of over 300 confirmed riders from 4 different Hells Angels chapters. I heard about it on Wednesday evening when Cole called me. I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, doing the thing I had been doing most evenings since we got back from Mill Haven, which was not quite reading and not quite thinking and not quite anything, just occupying space in a way that felt temporary even inside my own house. Cole told me the number and asked if I could help with logistics. Lumber, he said. Hardware and tools. He had Sandra making a list of what the house needed, based on what she had seen with her builder's eye during the storm visit. The cracked window, the fence sections, the drainage situation under the east side of the house, the porch rail, and a dozen other smaller things that revealed themselves to the right kind of attention. Sandra had specified cedar for the rail without being asked. Cole told me because she had noticed the grain of the original and wanted to match it. I told him I could be there at 6 in the morning on Saturday. He said good and hung up, because Cole did not linger on phone calls any more than he lingered on anything else. I sat on the porch a while longer after that with the cold coffee in the dark. I thought about Dorothy standing at her door. I thought about the wooden stool in the center of the basement room and the way she had sat on it. I thought about the envelope in my kitchen drawer with 23 letters that had never been sent. I did not sleep well that week. I had not slept particularly well in 8 years, but that week was its own category. Saturday came in clear and cold, the way Kansas October mornings come in. The kind of cold that is not yet serious, but wants you to know it is considering it. I was on the road by 5:45. The sky to the east was going from black to the particular dark blue that precedes everything else, and the fields on either side of Route 17 were still and flat, in the way that Kansas fields are still and flat, which is completely without reservation, offering no pretense of anything other than what they are. I was near the front of the column when we turned onto Alderman Street. Cole was ahead of me and ahead of Cole. There was nothing yet, just the quiet of a neighborhood still deciding whether to be awake. And then the street began to fill. I've been part of large rides many times over 53 years. Toy runs memorial rides, cross-country convoys of various kinds. I have heard a lot of engines running together in a lot of places. but 300 motorcycles turning onto a residential street in Mill Haven, Kansas on a cold October morning, filling it from the intersection all the way back to where I could no longer see where it ended. That was something different. The sound of it was not loud in the way explosions are loud. It was full the way a room is full when it contains exactly what it was built to contain, when the proportions are right and the space has finally met its purpose. Dorothy was at the window when we turned onto her block. By the time Cole reached her gate, she was on the porch in her coat, and her expression I was close enough to see. It was not fear, and it was not confusion. It was the expression of a person who has just revised an estimate that had already been set on the generous side. Cole stopped at the bottom of her steps. He looked at the missing rail. He looked at her. "We are fixing your porch," he said. She looked at him steadily. "And if I said I would rather you did not," she said. Cole considered this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. Then he told her that in that case they had hauled a considerable amount of lumber a long way for nothing, and that he would ask her to let them do it anyway. There was a pause. I held my breath, which is not something I do often and is not something I recommend. "The rail needs to be cedar," she said. "Walter used cedar, and it lasted 40 years. "We brought cedar," Cole said. She stepped back from the door. What happened in the next 6 hours is something I would have difficulty fully describing, even if I had another 53 years to find the right words for it. I've seen organized operations in my time. I've seen coordinated effort among large groups of people. What I watched that morning was something that went beyond organization into something that felt closer to instinct, as though 300 people had agreed on something without the agreement needing to be spoken. Cole and Sandra and a man named Dale Sutter, who ran a construction company out of Topeka and had arrived with a truck carrying enough equipment to address most of what the house needed, had divided the work into crew assignments before we got there. 4 people on the porch rail, a fence team, a crawlspace team, an interior team for the window and the bathroom faucet and the kitchen cabinet that had been slowly separating from the wall in the gutter section on the north side of the house that had come halfway loose in the storm and been left that way. I was assigned to the fence with Vern Hatch. Vern was about 70, as I have mentioned, and his hip was the kind of bad that had been bad for long enough to become part of his identity rather than a condition he was managing. He did not complain about it ever, which told you more about Vern than a long conversation would have. We worked the fence line together through most of the morning, and we did not talk much, which was fine. Some work has a rhythm that talking interrupts. You find the rhythm together and you stay in it, and the shared silence becomes its own kind of language. Around 10 in the morning, Dorothy brought 2 cups of coffee out to the fence line. She handed one to Vern and one to me and stood there for a moment, looking at what we had done. "Walter built that fence himself," she said. 1961. She paused. He did not know what he was doing. He figured it out as he went. She looked at it the way people look at things that contain more history than their surface suggests. Then she took her coffee back toward the house. I watched her go. There was something I had been carrying since the night I stood in my kitchen, looking at 23 unsent letters. Something that had been asking to be put into words for 11 days. And I had not found the words, and I was not certain I was ready to find them. But I was also tired of waiting to be ready. Tired in a way that had accumulated over 8 years and had arrived in the last 11 days at something close to urgency. I told Vern I would be back in a few minutes. He nodded without looking up from the fence post he was aligning because Vern Hatch was not a man who required explanation for ordinary human behavior. I found Dorothy at the edge of the yard watching the work on the porch rail. The new cedar was already up on one end, pale and straight, against the older wood of the porch frame. And it was good work, careful work, the kind that would last. I stood beside her and we watched for a while without speaking. Then she said, "Walter used to talk about a man he met on Route 66. This was 1963. They crossed paths at a gas station outside Amarillo, Texas, and ended up talking for 2 hours the way strangers sometimes do when neither of them has anywhere particular to be. The man was on a motorcycle. Walter was driving a Ford pickup with bad brakes that he was nursing west. The man's name was Roy, last name Decker." I became very still. Walter asked him where he was going, and Roy said he didn't know yet. Walter asked him where he was coming from, and Roy said Wichita. Walter said he had a boy there, a young one, and Roy said yes, 11 years old, and said nothing else for a while. Walter asked him when he was going back. Roy said he did not know how to go back. He said a man has to know what face to bring home with him, and he did not know what face that was anymore. Dorothy paused. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the porch rail going up in sections. Walter thought about that for 30 years, she said. He thought it was the saddest sentence he had ever heard a man say out loud. He wrote it down when he got home. It was in a notebook he kept in the nightstand drawer. I found it there after he died, and I did not know for years what it meant or who Roy was. The sound of hammers, the sound of a drill from somewhere inside the house. 300 people working in the ordinary morning sounds of a neighborhood. And underneath all of it, the quiet of what she had just said, settling into me like cold water finding level. I looked down at the ground. A patch of dead grass, some gravel. Ordinary ground. I asked her what Roy looked like. Roy looked. She described him. Medium height, she said. Lean. Dark hair going gray early. A scar on the left side of his chin from something he had not wanted to explain to Walter. Quiet eyes, Walter had said. The kind of eyes that had seen the inside of their own sadness for long enough. That sadness had become their natural expression. I stood with that for a moment. Then I nodded once slowly, the way you nod when you are confirming something that you already knew was true, but had spent a long time not confirming. Dorothy placed her hand on my forearm. One brief specific pressure, the kind that says, "I hear you." The kind that asks nothing in return. Then she took her hand away and we both continued watching the work on the porch. She did not ask me anything. She did not try to complete the connection out loud or make it mean more than what it already meant. That was something I understood about her by then, something that had been revealing itself across the morning in small demonstrations. She understood that some things do not need to be drawn to their conclusion in order to have their full weight. She understood that present, simple, undemanding presence was sometimes the only useful thing one person could offer another. Roy Decker had left his wife and his 11-year-old son in Wichita in 1963 and driven west on Route 66 and somewhere outside Amarillo. He had told a stranger that he did not know what face to bring home with him. And I was 59 years old, and I had 23 letters in a kitchen drawer, and I was standing in the yard of a woman I had met 11 days ago, and something in me that had been sealed for a very long time was working at its own seams. I went back to the fence line. Vern looked at me once briefly, and then looked back at what he was doing, and I was grateful for that in a way that I could not have explained to him. At noon, somebody set up a folding table at the edge of the yard, and food appeared. Brisket wrapped in foil, thick and dark and smelling of long hours in a smoker. Sandwiches, fruit in containers, coffee in carriers from a place in town. Someone had planned it. I found out later it was Jake Pruitt who had organized it, which surprised me for a moment before it did not. There was something in Jake that was always looking for the useful thing, the thing that needed doing that nobody had named yet. I ate near Dorothy. I had introduced myself properly for the first time, told her my name. Told her I had ridden with the chapter for 22 years. She had looked at me in the direct, undecorated way she looked at most things. "You were the second one off his bike," she said, "after Cole." I said yes. "I counted you in," she said, as though that explained why she remembered, which I supposed it did. I asked her how she was doing after the storm. She said fine, and the way she said it told me she was the kind of person for whom fine was not a deflection, but an active condition, something she made happen rather than something that happened to her. I asked if she had family nearby. "My daughter Ruth," she said. "Denver. She calls on Sundays." She said it without bitterness. Stated it as a fact, the way she stated most things. But facts have weight even when they are stated plainly. And I felt the weight of that one and chose not to press on it. The afternoon moved through its hours in the way good work moves time. Not slowly and not quickly, but purposefully, the way you know when you are in it, that the hours are being used for something that will outlast them. The porch rail went up in sections pale cedar against older wood. The fence line straightened itself. Inside the house, from what I could see through windows and doorways, a window was repaired. A cabinet was rehung, a bathroom faucet was addressed. A gutter section was reattached. Dorothy moved through all of it, answering questions with the precision of someone who has lived in a house long enough to know every one of its specific requirements. What type of hinge, how high the step had been, where the water shutoff was located. She answered each question once completely and did not elaborate beyond what was asked. And I watched people's expressions as she answered them, the slight release that crosses a person's face when they ask a question and receive exactly the information they needed, and nothing more. It was around 2 in the afternoon when I found myself near the side of the house, taking a break from the fence line, and Jake Pruitt came and stood near me. He was looking at nothing in particular, just the middle distance of the backyard, and we stood together in the way that men stand when something is working in them that has not yet found its words. I had been watching Jake that morning in the same way I had been watching him since the storm visit. There was something in how he worked that I recognized without being able to name, a quality of effort that went beyond the task. Men work that way sometimes when they are trying to discharge something that has no other outlet, when the physical act of doing is the only available language for something interior that will not be translated any other way. He had swept Dorothy's porch steps on the day of the storm until they were cleaner than they needed to be. He had gotten the generator running on the second pull with a concentration that had nothing to do with the generator. And today, he had organized brisket and sandwiches for 300 people on a Saturday morning. Because it was something that needed doing, and he could see that it needed doing. I told him he had done good work with the food. He shrugged in the particular way that young men shrug when they want to dismiss a compliment, but also want to receive it. He said it was nothing, just logistics. We stood quietly for a bit. Then I told him something I had not told anyone. I told him about the letters. Not all of it, not the hospital corridor, not the 8 years, not the full architecture of what had come apart between Garrett and me. Just the fact of them. 23 letters in a kitchen drawer, addressed, sealed, never sent. Jake was quiet for what felt like half a minute. He was looking at the fence line at the work Vern and I had done through the morning. Then he said that he had a text message in his phone, drafted to his mother. He had written it and rewritten it for 2 years. Different words each time, always the same basic thing. He had never sent it. I looked at him. Why not, I said. He thought about it. He thought about it the way young people think, sometimes not performing the thinking, but actually doing it. He said, if I send it and she does not answer, then it is over. But as long as it is still in the phone, there is still a chance she might. As long as I have not sent it, I have not been refused. He said it plainly as a simple statement of the arithmetic of it. And I stood there beside him with those words going through me like something that finds the exact place it was always meant to fit. That was my sentence. Not his. Mine. The sentence I had been living inside for 8 years, without ever having found the words for it. A 23-year-old man from the chapter had just handed me my own internal reasoning as though it were a simple and obvious thing, which it was, and which was exactly why it was so devastating to hear out loud. I did not say anything for a while. Jake did not seem to require me to. We stood in Dorothy Wainwright's backyard in the October light, and the work went on around us. And I thought about my son. I thought about the 4-hour drive from Missouri. I thought about the hospital corridor and Garrett's voice, not angry, which had been worse than anger. I thought about 23 envelopes in a kitchen drawer, and the specific logic of never sending them, the self-protective mathematics of perpetual possibility, the way hope can become a reason to do nothing. I thought about my father, Roy Decker, who had driven west on Route 66 in 1963 and told a stranger at a gas station outside Amarillo that he did not know what face to bring home with him, who had left an 11-year-old boy in Wichita and never come back, who had, in his own way, made the same calculation I had been making for 8 years. As long as he had not tried, he had not failed. As long as the possibility existed in the abstract, it did not have to be tested against reality. I had spent a great deal of my life being angry at Roy Decker. I had spent 53 years on a road that I now understood in this October afternoon light. He had also ridden looking for the same thing, failing to find it in the same way for the same reason. I went to find Dorothy. She was in the backyard, sitting in a lawn chair that someone had placed in a patch of afternoon sun near the east wall of the house. She had a cup of something warm in both hands, and she watched me cross the yard toward her with the expression she usually wore, attentive and unhurried. I sat down on the ground near her chair. There was a low wooden step there, from a back door that no one used anymore, and I sat on it, and for a moment I just let the sun be warm and the sounds of work go on around us. Then I told her about Garrett, not the way I'd been organizing it in my head carefully with context and explanation. The way you say a thing when you have been not saying it for long enough that the effort of continued silence becomes greater than the fear of speaking. I told her about his mother, about the call I got in Missouri, about the 4 hours and 20 minutes of driving, about arriving at the hospital and her still being there and being there when she died, about the corridor afterward and Garrett's voice saying you were always there for the last part. I told her about the letters, 23 of them, 8 years, the address in Oklahoma City that might not even be current anymore. She listened. She did not nod sympathetically in the particular performance of listening that people do. She just listened the way the basement had been quiet, the way the road is sometimes quiet when you are riding through something and there is nothing to do but be in it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she went inside the house. She was back in under 3 minutes. She was carrying a coffee mug, blue ceramic with a chip on one side of the rim that had been there long enough that the chipped edge had worn smooth. She held it out to me. "Walter drank from that cup every morning for 40 years, she said. He said a man should drink his coffee from something that has some history in it, something that has been around long enough to have earned its flaws." I took it from her. It was not heavy. It was warm from whatever she had just heated in it. "Why give this to me?" I asked. She looked at me steadily with the specific, unhurried directness that I had come to understand was her natural mode of address. "Because Roy Decker never went back to Wichita," she said. "He did not know what face to bring home, and so he brought none. You have been carrying 23 letters in a drawer for 8 years, and you have not sent them. And the reason you have not sent them is the same reason he did not go back." She paused. "You still have time that he did not." I held the mug. I looked at it. Ceramic blue, one chipped edge, worn smooth from 40 years of mornings. The small weight of it in my hands. I want to tell you about that moment with some accuracy, because I think accuracy matters more than drama when it comes to the things that actually change you. It was not dramatic. Dorothy did not say anything that I had not on some level already known. What she did was make it possible for me not to look away from it. That is a different thing from being told something new. It is being held still long enough to see what has been there all along. I sat on that low step with Walter Wainwright's coffee mug in both hands, and the October sun on my back, and the sounds of 300 people working, and I let myself look at what I had been managing not to look at for 8 years. I stayed near Dorothy for the rest of the afternoon, not always talking, often not talking at all. She told me other things across those hours in the incremental way she told most things, a detail here, a detail there. She told me about Walter, about who he had been in the ordinary textures of daily life. The Route 66 drive in a car with no air conditioning. The argument about an exit in Albuquerque that had apparently never been fully resolved to anyone's satisfaction. The way he had built the fence in 1961 without knowing what he was doing, figuring it out as he went. The way people figure out most things that matter. She told me that missing someone every day is not the same as not being all right, and that she was always confused when people mix those two things up as though grief and function could not occupy the same person at the same time. She said she had been mixing them up herself for the first year after Walter died until she stopped and simply let both of them be true at once. I asked her if it got easier. "It gets familiar," she said. "Familiar is not easy, but it is workable." By 3 in the afternoon, the porch rail was complete. Cedar straight fitted to the house as though it had been there always. Cole stood back and looked at it. He had the expression he had when something had been done right. Dorothy walked to the edge of the porch and put her hand on the new rail. She stood there for a moment with her hand on it the way you put your hand on something to see if it is solid. "Walter used cedar," she said, "and it lasted 40 years. She looked at the rail, and then at the yard full of people and trucks, and the evidence of a day of purposeful work. Then she said, 'You can come back and address the rest of the porch if you feel the need to.' Cole said he intended to. I believe he meant it," she said. And she went back inside. We loaded up as the light went horizontal, that long October light that makes the Kansas flatlands look like something that should be remembered. The tools went back into Dale Sutter's truck. The leftover lumber was stacked in Dorothy's shed. The folding table was broken down and returned to whoever had brought it. Cole found me at my bike as we were getting ready to pull out. She told me something he said. "This afternoon." He paused in the way of a man locating the precise words for a thing. He said Dorothy had told him about a conversation they had had on the third Saturday. A conversation I had not been witness to, and I did not ask him to tell me what was said. Some conversations belonged to the people who had them. What he told me was the end of it. She had said the worst thing a man can do to someone he loves is decide on their behalf, that they cannot bear the weight of who he actually is. Cole looked at his hands on the handlebars. I had a letter in my pocket for 3 months, he said, from Claire. I told myself I was waiting for the right time to read it. He shook his head. I was deciding for her that she could not handle whatever she had written. I was deciding that before I even knew what it said. I looked at the cedar rail on Dorothy's porch, pale and solid in the late light. "Are you going to read it?" I asked. "Already did," he said. "This afternoon." We both looked at the house. It was a birthday card, he said, for Owen, my grandson, 4 years old. He likes trucks. He said it the way a man says something that has been waiting to be said for a long time, and is finding out in the saying of it that it does not destroy him. I rode home in the dark. Route 17 west toward Wichita, the fields on either side black and invisible. The road a strip of light in the headlamp, and the sky an enormous amount of nothing overhead. I had Walter Wainwright's blue mug in my saddlebag wrapped in my riding jacket. Dorothy had insisted I take it, and I had not argued because you do not argue with a woman who stood at her door in a wrong-colored sky and counted 79 strangers into her basement. I went home. I put the mug on the kitchen counter where I would see it in the morning. I opened the kitchen drawer and I took out the envelope with the 23 letters. I didn't put it back. I sat at the kitchen table with it in front of me and I thought about Jake Pruitt saying if I send it, and she does not answer, then it is over. But as long as it is still in the phone, there is still a chance. I thought about Roy Decker outside Amarillo, telling Walter Wainwright he did not know what face to bring home with him. I thought about Dorothy saying he did not go back. You still have time. I took the letter on the top of the stack. The most recent one, the one I had written 6 weeks ago. I held it. I turned it over and looked at the address on the front in my own handwriting. Garrett Decker with the Oklahoma City address below it. I set it back on the table. I sat there in the kitchen for a long time. Long enough that the coffee I made went cold. Long enough that the neighborhood went fully quiet outside, and the clock above the stove moved through an hour and into another. I did not put the letters back in the drawer. That was not nothing. It was not the thing itself, not yet. But it was the first night in 8 years that I had sat with them out in the open in the light without putting them away. And something in that felt different from anything that had come before it. Not resolved. Not finished. Something more like the first step of a staircase, when you do not yet know how many stairs there are, or what is waiting at the top. But your foot has found the first one, and the wood has held your weight, and there is nothing left now but to find out what comes next. Cole left for Portland on a Thursday. He did not take his motorcycle. He rented a car from a place on the east side of Wichita, a plain sedan the color of nothing in particular. And he drove north and then west through the remainder of Kansas and into Colorado and up through the corner of Idaho and finally into Oregon. 2 days of driving across the country. He had spent 30 years crossing on 2 wheels. I asked him afterward why he had not ridden. He thought about it the way he thought about most things, with the specific patience of a man who does not answer until he has the right answer. He said he wanted it to feel like an arrival. He said when you ride into something, you are still partly on the road, still partly in the motion of it, still partly wherever you came from. He said he wanted to be entirely there when he got there, not half somewhere else. He said he had been half somewhere else for 2 years and he was done with that particular arrangement. I thought about that for a long time after he told me. I thought about 53 years of arriving places on a motorcycle, and how much of each arrival had been a continuation of departure rather than a true landing. How the road has a way of keeping a part of you, even after you have stopped moving, holding you in the condition of transit, so that you never fully settle anywhere, never fully commit to the place where you are. Cole came back the following week. I saw him on Wednesday at the chapter house outside in the parking lot, leaning against his bike in the afternoon sun. He looked the same as he always looked. He was not more talkative or visibly different in any way that a photograph would have captured. But I have known Cole Hargrove for 15 years, and there is a quality that some men carry when they have been putting something heavy down for a long time and have finally set it on the ground. Not lightness exactly, more like a redistribution. Like the weight is still there, but it is no longer being held in one place. He told me Owen liked trucks, every kind of truck. Garbage trucks were a specific area of intense interest. He said this in the tone of a man reporting something of genuine significance. And it was, and he knew it was, and we both sat with the significance of it in the ordinary way of two men who do not need to make more of a thing than the thing already is. He said Claire had come outside when he pulled up. He said they had stood on the sidewalk in front of her building in the specific uncertainty of two people who love each other and have forgotten the mechanics of expressing it, the choreography of it gone unfamiliar from years of disuse. He said she had stepped toward him first. He said he had put his arms around her and she had not let go for a while. Owen was watching from the doorway, Cole said, just standing there in his rain boots, looking at them completely calm, like a 4-year-old who had decided in advance to be pleased by whatever happened next. He got a photo, blurry as Cole's photos always were because he had never successfully learned to tap the screen before shooting, and I had given up trying to teach him. But you could see the three of them clearly enough. A big man with gray in his beard, careful not to take up too much space. A woman with her hand on his arm. A small boy in rain boots looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone making a favorable assessment of current events. Cole showed me the photo once and did not mention it again, which was exactly right. I went back to Mill Haven the following Saturday and the Saturday after that and the one after that. A smaller group by then, 8 or 12 or 15 of us rotating through, showing up with coffee and whatever the house still needed, which turned out to be more than any of us had seen on the first visit. Not because the house was failing, because it had been maintained by one person alone for a long time. And one person alone can only see so far into every corner, can only address so many things in the available hours of a day. And the gaps that accumulate over years of solitary maintenance are quiet gaps, the kind that do not announce themselves, but only become visible to a second set of eyes. Vern Hatch came most Saturdays. He rearranged things without being asked and secured them without commenting on what he had done, which was exactly the kind of help that is most useful and most rare. Jake Pruitt came every week without exception. He had found his rhythm in Dorothy's house the same way I had found mine at the fence line, through the physical act of showing up and being useful, through the specific therapy of work that outlasts the hours you put into it. I had my own rhythm by then. I arrived early, took whatever assignment needed filling, and found my way to Dorothy's company at some point in the morning or afternoon, usually at the edge of the yard, or on the repaired porch, sometimes in the kitchen over coffee. The conversations we had across those Saturdays were not long and not always deep in the way that conversations are usually described as deep meaning weighted with revelation and emotion. They were often quiet and oblique and full of the kind of ordinary detail that accumulates into a picture of a person the way individual brushstrokes accumulate into something you can step back from and recognize. She told me about the summer of 1971, when the heat was so extreme that the asphalt on Alderman Street went soft, and the children wrote their names in it with sticks. And some of those names were still there the following spring in the hardened surface like a record. She told me about the church choir she had sung in for 31 years, and the particular quality of silence that a room full of people makes when they are about to begin singing together. She told me about the drawer in the kitchen, where Walter kept the things that had no other place, a button from a coat. He no longer owned a key whose lock had been replaced years ago. A photograph of a gas station in Arizona that neither of them could remember stopping at. She was 89 years old when Walter died, she told me one Saturday in late October. I've done the arithmetic several times since, and it settles at that number. 8 years alone in the house they had shared for 51 years. 8 years of Sunday phone calls from Denver, and the company of neighbors and the work of maintaining a house and a life with the specific self-reliance of someone who has never assumed that the world would provide what she needed without her own effort. I asked her once if she had been lonely. She considered this for longer than I expected. There is lonely that comes from being alone, she said, and there is lonely that comes from not being known. She paused. Walter knew me completely. Everything I was and everything I was not. After he died, I was alone, but I was still known because being known does not stop when the person who knows you stops being here. It lives in you. She looked at the yard. The second kind of lonely is worse. I have felt both, and I am clear about which is worse. I thought about Garrett. I thought about 23 letters in a drawer. I thought about what it meant to be known, and what it meant to withhold yourself from that possibility, to decide in advance that you could not be known, without also being found inadequate, and to choose the loneliness of not trying over the risk of trying, and being found wanting. It was the third Saturday in October when Dorothy told me about Walter's son. We were on the porch in the afternoon, the work done for the day, most of the others already loading up or gathered at their bikes. The light was going long and orange the way it goes in Kansas in October, making everything it touches look like it has been waiting all year for this particular quality of illumination. Walter had been married before, she said. Before me. A woman in Missouri married young the way people married young in those years without knowing yet who they were going to become. They had a son together. The marriage ended and Walter came to Kansas and met Dorothy and built the life I knew him in. And the son in Missouri grew up without his father in the way that sons sometimes grow up in the specific absence of a man who is alive somewhere but not present. Walter tried to contact him when he was in his 50s, she said. He wrote letters. He made calls. The son, whose name was Daniel, did not respond for years. And then one day he did. And they began the slow and difficult work of becoming known to each other, across the distance of everything that had not happened between them. They had 11 years, she said. Walter died when Daniel was 63. 11 years of phone calls and 2 visits, and the gradual construction of something that was not what it might have been if the years had gone differently, but was real and was theirs and was enough. Walter said toward the end that 11 years was not enough. She paused. I told him 11 years was 11 years more than nothing. The orange light on the porch rail, the cedar pale and straight and solid under my hand. I asked her if Walter had regretted waiting so long to reach out. Every day, she said. And then she said, but regret, is information. It tells you what mattered. What you do with the information is up to you. I rode home that evening with Walter's blue mug in my saddlebag and Dorothy's words sitting in my chest like something that had been placed there carefully and was waiting to be picked up and used. I went into the kitchen. I put the mug on the counter. I opened the drawer, and I took out the envelope with the 23 letters and I set it on the table. I sat with it for a while. Then I opened the envelope and I took out the 23 letters and I laid them on the table in the order I had written them, 8 years of envelopes with Garrett's name and the Oklahoma City address in my handwriting. I opened the most recent one, the one I had written 6 weeks ago, and I read it. My own words back to me, measured and careful, and full of the specific restraint of someone who has been editing himself in anticipation of judgment for so long that the editing has become invisible to him. I read all of them. It took most of the evening. When I finished, I sat for a long time looking at the table covered in paper. In my own handwriting, in 8 years of things I had needed to say, and had found a way to not say. Then I took the most recent letter, the one from 6 weeks ago, and I put it back in its envelope, and I sealed it, and I took a stamp from the kitchen drawer, and I put it on the upper right corner, and I wrote Garrett's Oklahoma City address on the front. I did not think about it extensively. I'd been thinking about it for 8 years, and the thinking had produced 23 unsent letters, and I was done with that particular method. I put the envelope on the kitchen counter next to Walter Wainwright's blue mug, where I would see it in the morning, and I went to bed. In the morning, I looked at it for a while over coffee. Then I picked up my phone. This is the part I have the most difficulty describing accurately. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so ordinary. And the ordinariness of it was the thing that mattered most. I picked up my phone and I found Garrett's number, which I had kept in my contacts for 8 years, without using, and I called it. I did not rehearse what I would say. I had been rehearsing what I would say for 8 years, and it had not produced a single phone call. And so I stopped rehearsing and I called. He answered on the 3rd ring. He said his name the way people answer calls from numbers they do not have saved carefully without commitment. And I said his name back, and there was a silence of about 4 seconds. And then he said, "Dad." Just the word. Just that. We talked for 20 minutes. It was not a long conversation, and it was not a smooth one. It moved the way conversations move when 2 people have been not talking for 8 years and have suddenly decided to try with gaps and restarts and the occasional wrong turn into something that needed to be backed away from and approached differently. We talked about nothing of consequence and about everything of consequence. And I am not going to tell you the specific words of it because those words belong to Garrett and to me. What I will tell you is this. Near the end of it, he asked why I was calling now after 8 years. And I told him about Dorothy. I told him about the storm and the basement and the wooden stool in the center of the room and the woman who sat on it. I told him about the soup in the mismatched bowls and the cedar porch rail and the blue ceramic mug on my kitchen counter. I told him about 23 letters in a drawer and about Roy Decker outside Amarillo, telling a stranger he did not know what face to bring home with him. Garrett was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "I have been waiting for you to call for 8 years. I said, "I know." I did not know how to start. He said, "Neither did I." 20 minutes. Awkward and incomplete and real the way the first conversation of something new is always awkward and incomplete and real. We agreed to talk again. We did not make a specific plan, and we did not need to because we had gotten past the threshold of the thing, and the threshold was what had been the problem. The next morning, I walked the letter to the mailbox before I made coffee. Then I went inside and stood in the kitchen with Walter Wainwright's blue mug in both hands, and I drank my coffee and looked out the window at the ordinary neighborhood street and the ordinary Kansas morning light, and I let both things be true at once. The weight of 8 years and the fact that the phone call had happened and the door was open and there was no going back to before. Familiar is not easy, Dorothy had said, but it is workable. I went back to Mill Haven the following Saturday and the one after that. I told Dorothy that I had called. She did not make much of it, which was the response I needed from her. She nodded once and said good, and then asked if I wanted more coffee, and I said yes. And we sat on the porch in the November air and talked about the fence and about the drainage situation under the east side of the house that Dale Sutter had addressed. But that would need to be checked in spring. Garrett and I talked twice more in November. Shorter calls, both times the length of people who are finding a frequency rather than establishing one. He told me a little about his work. I told him a little about the chapter. We were careful with each other, in the way of people handling something new and not yet certain of its limits. But we were careful with each other, which was different from nothing. Ruth came back in November. Dorothy mentioned it one Saturday as a simple fact, the way she mentioned most things that mattered to her briefly and without ceremony. Ruth had driven up from Denver for 4 days. They had fixed the kitchen cabinet together and driven to the cemetery where Walter was buried, and sat in the living room for an hour without the television and without needing it. Dorothy said it was a start. From Dorothy, I had come to understand a start was the highest possible assessment of a beginning. December came to Kansas. The way December comes to Kansas decisively, as though autumn had simply run out of patience and handed everything over without further negotiation. The fields went to their winter flatness. The sky went to its winter gray. The cold became the serious kind, the kind that has no interest in being temporary. The Christmas gathering at Dorothy's house was not a workday. That was new. There had been a brief collective uncertainty when we arrived, and there was no task list, no lumber in the truck, no assignment waiting. Men who worked together in a particular context sometimes struggle to occupy the same space without the context. But it resolved quickly the way things resolve when the place is right, and the people are right, and the season is doing what it is supposed to do. There were about 30 of us. Sandra brought a poinsettia. Vern Hatch arrived first and rearranged the chairs in the living room with his characteristic quiet efficiency, as though the chairs had been waiting for him specifically to sort them out. Jake brought a tin of cookies his mother had made and presented them with a solemnity that communicated clearly that they were not to be treated as ordinary cookies. There was a single string of lights along the new porch rail. I did not know who had put them there, and I did not ask because some things are better without attribution. The cedar pale beneath the small lights in the December dark, solid and level. The work of hands that had come from 4 different Hell's Angels chapters. For a woman none of them had known before September. Cole was there with a photograph in his vest pocket. Owen in his rain boots specifically. He showed it to 2 people and then put it away because Cole was not a man who required an audience for the things that mattered most to him. I arrived early. I had left Wichita before 7, which was not necessary and was entirely necessary, and I had come up Route 17 in the dark, with the heater doing what it could against the Kansas December, thinking about a Tuesday in September, when the sky had been the wrong color, and a woman had stood at her door and held it open. I turned onto Alderman Street. The Christmas lights on Dorothy's porch rail were visible from the corner. I pulled up and parked and sat on my bike for a moment in the cold air looking at the house. The cracked window had been repaired. The fence line ran straight. The porch was level and solid, the cedar rail pale in the string-like glow. The house looked like what it was, a house that had been lived in fully and cared for thoroughly, and was still standing as it had stood through every storm that had ever tried it. There was a car parked in front of the house that I had not seen before. Oklahoma plates. I sat on my bike and looked at those plates for a moment. The cold was significant, and I was not dressed for standing still in it, and I was not moving. The front door opened and Jake Pruitt came out onto the porch. He looked at me. He nodded once. It was the nod of a man who has done something and is not apologizing for it, and is not requiring thanks for it. The nod of a simple fact being acknowledged. I got off my bike. I walked to the porch steps. I looked at Jake and he looked at me, and I said his name as a question. He said he had found Garrett's number in the chapter's general contact sheet from an event 4 years back, when Garrett had attended a memorial ride and left his information. He said he had sent a text message from his own phone 3 weeks ago. He told me what it had said, and he said it plainly in the way he said most things. Your dad talks about you every Saturday. He just does not know how to start. Neither did I. So I started for him. I stood at the bottom of Dorothy's porch steps in the December cold and looked at Jake Pruitt. He also said that he had sent his own text message to his mother on the same morning, the one he had been drafting and redrafting for 2 years in his phone. He said he had sent Garrett's text first, and then thought that if he was doing it for someone else, he had no reason not to do it for himself, and so he had. His mother had called him within the hour. They had talked for 3 hours. She was coming to Wichita in January. He said all of this in the same even tone, standing on Dorothy's porch in his jacket, with his hands in his pockets, as though the events he was describing were of moderate rather than complete significance. Then he stepped aside and held the door open. I went in. The house was warm and full of the particular sound of people gathered in a space that fits them. Conversation at the right volume, movement in the kitchen. The low music someone had put on that was present without demanding attention. The smell of the house the same as it had been the first time I crossed the threshold. Soup and cedar and old wood that had absorbed decades of living and given it back as warmth. I stood in the entrance and looked into the living room. Garrett was standing near the fireplace. He was 35 years old, and he had his mother's eyes, which I had not looked directly into for 8 years, and his grandfather's way of standing, which I recognized in a place below. Thought in the part of the body that knows things the mind has to catch up to. He was holding something, both hands around it looking down at it. Walter Wainwright's blue ceramic mug with the chipped edge, worn smooth from 40 years of mornings. I stood in the doorway and looked at my son. He looked up. There was a moment between us, the specific moment of two people who have been a long time away from each other, and are now in the same room and must decide what the room will hold. A moment where everything that has not been said is briefly visible on the surface before it finds its place below. Then he said, "She gave this to me when I arrived. She said it was yours until I came to get it." He held it out toward me, an offering or a question or both. I crossed the room. I stood in front of my son for the first time in 8 years. I did not take the mug. Instead, I put my hand on his shoulder, the way a father puts his hand on his son's shoulder, when words have not yet caught up to what the body already knows it needs to do. Garrett did not step back. He stood where he was and let my hand be there. And after a moment, he put his own hand briefly over mine, 1 second of contact. And then we were just standing there, two people figuring out the mechanics of a thing. They should have been practicing for years and had not been. And that was all right because the mechanics can be learned, and the important thing was that we were in the same room and neither of us was leaving. I do not know how long we stood there. Not very long by clock time. Long enough. Dorothy was in the kitchen. I could hear her voice from where I stood answering someone's question about where she kept the extra cups, precise and unhurried as always. She had given my son the mug that she had given me to carry for a month. The mug that had sat on my kitchen counter every morning while I worked up to making a phone call. And she had given it to him the moment he walked through her door, as though she had known exactly what it was for and who it ultimately belonged to. Some things are managed the way a river manages its course, not by force, but by the patient persistence of finding where the ground is willing to give. Jake Pruitt was in the corner of the living room with his phone out, a video call in progress, his mother's voice coming through the small speaker in the particular compressed quality of phone audio. He was turned slightly toward the wall for privacy, but not entirely, and I could hear enough to know that she was describing something, some ordinary detail of her week. And he was listening with the specific attention of someone who has not had enough of a thing for too long, and is now careful not to waste any of it. Cole was near the window with his phone out as well, reading a message from Claire or writing one back. I could not tell which, and it did not matter. Owen had apparently sent a drawing of a garbage truck through Claire's phone, detailed in the way that 4-year-old drawings are detailed, which is to say, completely and without concern for proportion, and Cole was studying it with the seriousness it deserved. Sandra was in the kitchen helping Dorothy with something, their voices going back and forth in the easy rhythm of two women who have arrived at a practical understanding. Vern Hatch was seated in the chair nearest the fireplace, which was the warmest position in the room, and he had selected it without comment and without apology, which was Vern's consistent method. Earl Tatum was near the back wall, quiet, in the way he was always quiet. The Louisiana stillness that seemed to carry its own weather system. I found a place near the edge of the room and I stayed in it for a while watching. Garrett moved through the space with the careful navigation of someone in an unfamiliar room, talking to people being talked to, finding his way. He laughed once at something Earl said, a short, honest laugh, and I heard it from across the room, and I held it there in my chest for a moment before I let it continue. His mother's laugh, his own laugh, the laugh of a person who has not lost the ability to find something funny, even in the years when there has not been much to find. Dorothy came out of the kitchen at some point in the evening and moved through the rooms in the way she moved through everything, steady and deliberate and without performance. She refilled cups. She answered questions. She said something dry to Jake that produced a delayed laugh from 3 people who had not appeared to be listening but apparently were, because that was the kind of thing Dorothy said. The kind that finds its way to everyone in the room eventually. She called Jake by a different name once in passing, corrected herself without explanation, and moved on. He caught my eye briefly across the room. I understood what she had meant. Daniel was Walter's son, found again after 11 years of silence. Jake was 23 years old and had just given a man his son back and had called his own mother in the same morning. Dorothy knew exactly who she was looking at, even when the name came out wrong. I ended up on the porch at some point in the evening. The cold out there was serious, and I had not brought enough for standing still in it. But sometimes serious cold is the right companion for certain kinds of thinking. The kind that benefits from the body being occupied with something immediate, so the mind can work at its own pace. The string of lights on the cedar rail threw a small warm light across the porch boards. The street beyond was quiet, empty, the neighborhood in the particular late evening stillness of a December weeknight, when most people are inside, and the outside belongs to no one specific. Cole came out after a few minutes. He stood beside me at the rail, and we looked at the street and said nothing for a while, which was an old and comfortable habit. He said he kept thinking about something. He said she counted us in, that September in the tornado. She stood at her door and she counted every one of us into the basement. I looked at the cedar rail under my hands, the smooth, pale surface of it, the work of careful hands on a Saturday in October. I said I knew. He said 79 men. She did not know one of us. The sky was doing what it was doing. And she stood there and she made sure not one of us got left outside. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief. The way a man shakes his head when he has turned something over long enough to finally understand its full weight. Some people are just built that way, I said. No, Cole said. He was quiet for a moment. Nobody is just built that way. That is a choice you make so many times for so many years that it becomes who you are. It is built. She built it. There is a difference. I thought about that. I thought about Walter building a fence in 1961 without knowing what he was doing, figuring it out as he went. I thought about 11 years with a son he had not known, built one phone call at a time from the ground up without a plan, and without the certainty that the effort would be met. I thought about 53 years on the road and what I had been looking for in all those miles, and what it had taken a 97-year-old woman in Mill Haven, Kansas, to make visible. Cole went back inside after a while. I heard his voice through the door saying something about Owen's drawing, and somebody laughed. And then the door swung closed, and I was alone on the porch with the cold and the string lights and the cedar rail and the quiet street. I am 72 years old. My knees have opinions about December cold that I have learned to negotiate with rather than ignore. I have been on this road for 53 years through 41 states, and I have put more miles between myself and the things that mattered to me than I could account for if you asked me to try. I've been thinking about what Cole said, standing on that porch, about the difference between being built a certain way and building yourself a certain way through the accumulated choices of a long life, about Dorothy Wainwright on a September porch in a wrong-colored sky who did not appear to be doing anything extraordinary when she opened her door and held it, who appeared to be doing the most ordinary thing imaginable, the simple human thing of making sure no one got left outside. Some rides take you somewhere. I have said that already, but I want to say it differently now from the far end of this particular ride, with the benefit of what I know that I did not know in September of that year. Some rides take you somewhere you did not know you were going, and the somewhere is not a place on a map. It is not a state you have not crossed or a road you have not ridden. It is something more like a recognition. The slow arrival at an understanding that has been available to you for years but required a specific set of conditions to become visible. Required in this case a woman standing at a door and a wrong-colored sky and a basement full of men going quiet in a way that was entirely respectful. I had ridden for 53 years looking for the thing that riding was supposed to provide, and I had found it, and it was not the road, and it was not the motion, and it was not the particular feeling of a long stretch of empty highway in good weather, when you can see tomorrow from today. It was something else entirely, something that had been waiting on Alderman and 5th Street in Mill Haven, in the house of a woman who kept 30 years of canned goods in her basement and a blue ceramic mug in her kitchen cabinet that had belonged to a man she had missed every day for 8 years, without for one moment losing her bearings. Through the door I could hear voices. I could hear Garrett. He was telling someone something I could not make out what. And then he laughed, that laugh honest and unguarded, the laugh of a person who has been in the presence of something unexpected and good and has let it land. I put my hand on the cedar rail one more time, smooth and solid and pale in the string light. Built to last, built to hold, built by hands that had come from a long way away for a reason that nobody had fully articulated, but everybody had understood. Then I turned and I went back inside where it was warm, and where my son was laughing at something I had not yet heard, and where a 97-year-old woman in a blue cardigan was moving through her living room on a December evening with the steady, unhurried presence of someone who has been opening doors her whole life and has never once stopped to wonder whether the person on the other side was worth opening them for.